Imagine this. A single woman's body, taken without permission in 1951, becomes the foundation for every medical breakthrough of the last 70 years. Imagine the polio vaccine, cancer drugs, and even space travel, all relying on her cells. Her name was Henrietta Lacks. Her cells, HeLa, are immortal. Her story is the most astonishing injustice in medical history. The year is 1920. In Roanoke, Virginia, a girl is born, named Loretta, but she will be called Henrietta. She grew up on a tobacco farm in Clover, Virginia, living a life of deep poverty common among black communities in the Jim Crow South. Her life was defined by hard work, tilling fields, harvesting crops, and tending to the needs of a large, complex family. She had a laugh that was described as infectious, a vibrant personality, and a captivating beauty. She married her cousin, David, or Day, Lacks, and together they moved to Turner Station, a small, bustling black community just outside Baltimore, Maryland, where Day found work at Bethlehem Steel, the largest steel mill in the world. By 1950, Henrietta was a mother of 5 children: Lawrence, Elsie, David Jr., or Sonny, Deborah, and Zachariah, born Joe. She was the anchor of her family, a provider, a protector. The knot of pain. In January 1951, Henrietta, then 30, went to her husband with a terrifying complaint. She had a knot in her womb, she said, a feeling of an internal lump that had been there since the birth of her last child, Joe. It was a lump that bled abnormally, a painful irregularity she could no longer ignore. She was referred to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. At the time, Johns Hopkins was one of the few hospitals in the area that treated black patients, though it operated in a system of segregated wards and clinics. Dr. Howard Jones, one of the top gynecologists, examined her. He found a malignant tumor, a nickel-sized purplish mass on her cervix. The diagnosis? Cervical cancer. At the time, the treatment for cervical cancer was brutal. Radium tube inserts, a medieval-sounding procedure that involved placing tubes containing radioactive material directly against the tumor. But before the treatment began, a procedure was carried out that would irrevocably alter history: the unspoken biopsy. During her examination, 2 small tissue samples were taken from her cervix. One sample was of healthy tissue nearby, the other of the cancerous tumor itself. This was a routine procedure at Hopkins. The hospital's tissue culture lab, headed by Dr. George Otto Guy, was engaged in a desperate search to find a way to grow human cells outside the body, a quest that had defeated scientists for decades. If they could keep human cells alive and dividing indefinitely in a petri dish, it would be an unimaginable boon for medical research, a living, breathing model of human biology. Here's the critical, astonishing truth. No one asked Henrietta Lacks for her permission to take these samples for research. They were taken as she lay on the operating table, unaware that anything other than her immediate treatment was occurring. In 1951, the legal and ethical framework for informed consent was virtually non-existent, especially in segregated public clinics. The samples were taken, labeled HeLa for the first 2 letters of her first and last names, and sent to Dr. Guy's lab. Dr. George Guy and his assistant, Mary Kubitschek, had a protocol. They had tried to grow thousands of human cell samples, but every single one had failed. The cells would live for a few days, divide a few times, and then inevitably die. The limit was the Hayflick limit, the natural biological programming of human cells to undergo only a finite number of divisions before senescence. But the HeLa cells were different. A few days after receiving Henrietta's sample, Mary Kubitschek checked the cultures. She saw a sight that should have been impossible. The HeLa cells weren't dying. They were thriving. They were dividing with a frightening speed and tenacity, doubling their number every 24 hours. The cancer that was destroying Henrietta Lacks' body had given her cells a terrifying biological gift: immortality. This was the first successful, sustained human cell line in history. It was a scientific miracle. Guy's lab had finally found the living blueprint they had been seeking. The cell line was capable of dividing an infinite number of times. A race against time. While Henrietta Lacks' cells were multiplying wildly in test tubes, her own body was losing the war. The radium treatments failed. The cancer spread aggressively. She endured terrible pain, which the doctors struggled to control. Her last desperate hope was a course of X-ray treatments. On August 8, 1951, she was admitted for her final stay at Johns Hopkins. She was racked with pain, her organs failing as the immortal cells in the lab consumed her. Henrietta Lacks died on October 4, 1951, at the age of 31. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the family's land in Clover, Virginia. No one in her family was told that a part of her was still alive. Global commodification. Dr. Guy initially intended to keep the HeLa cells confined to his lab, but the demand for a living human cell line was overwhelming. Scientists needed them to understand viruses, test toxicity, and find cures. Guy soon began sharing them with colleagues, initially for free, as was the scientific custom. But the demand was so great that a commercial market quickly emerged. The National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, the organization behind the March of Dimes, needed a tool to test Jonas Salk's new polio vaccine. The sheer volume of cells required was astronomical. An industrial-scale cell culture factory was set up at the Tuskegee Institute, and HeLa cells were shipped across the country, and then the world, by the millions. They were packaged in small vials, shipped via air freight, and sold for profit. HeLa had gone from a small, unnamed sample to a global industrial product. The cells became the backbone of a multi-billion-dollar research industry.
The uses of HeLa cells are beyond counting, a testament to their astonishing biological power and the speed with which they reproduce. The polio vaccine. Without HeLa cells, the successful mass testing of the Salk polio vaccine would have been impossible. The cells were the living canvas upon which the virus and the cure were studied. Space travel. HeLa cells were the first human cells ever sent into space. They traveled on the Discoverer 17 satellite in 1960 to study the effects of zero gravity and radiation on human biology. Gene mapping. The very first human gene, the gene for an enzyme called glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, or G6PD, was mapped using HeLa cells. In vitro fertilization, or IVF. HeLa cells were used to culture and test the techniques that led to the development of IVF. Cancer and AIDS research. They remain the gold standard for studying the mechanisms of cancer, HIV/AIDS, and countless other diseases. They are, quite literally, the foundation for much of modern oncology and virology. It is estimated that if all the HeLa cells ever grown were laid end-to-end, they would wrap around the Earth at least 3 times. If weighed, they would exceed 50 million metric tons. A small, unconsenting sample from a poor black tobacco farmer became the most important tool in biomedical history. The family's ignorance. For over 20 years, the Lacks family knew nothing. They were grieving a daughter and a mother, wondering if they would ever be able to afford a headstone. They lived in poverty, unable to afford health insurance, even as her cells, their mother's cells, were making fortunes and saving lives around the world. The first hint came in 1973. A scientist named Victor McCusick reached out to Lacks and his children, explaining that Henrietta's cells were still alive. He needed blood samples from the family to study the Lacks' unique genetics to help stop a widespread contamination problem. The HeLa contamination, the astonishing vitality of HeLa, became its own problem. Because they were so robust, they could easily outgrow and take over other weaker cell cultures. By the 1960s, a crisis was unfolding. Research labs around the world, studying everything from mice to monkeys, discovered that the human cells they thought they were studying were actually HeLa. The Immortal cells had contaminated thousands of experiments, leading to the collapse of years of research. The Lacks family, however, was terrified by the request for blood. They were poor, uneducated about science, and had a deep-seated fear of the medical establishment. They interpreted the request as a medical experiment on them, a terrifying attempt to take more of their bodies, or perhaps to use the blood to clone their deceased mother. Their fear was rooted in the historical reality of racialized medical abuse in the United States, including events like the Tuskegee syphilis study. In a profoundly ethical failure, the scientists, primarily concerned with the contamination problem, did a terrible job of explaining who Henrietta was, what her cells were doing, and why they needed the family's blood. They used complex scientific jargon, failing to bridge the massive gap between the lab bench and the family's living room. The family was left more confused and frightened than before. The public reveal. In 1976, an article about Henrietta Lacks and the HeLa cells was published in Rolling Stone magazine, followed by an article in the New York Times. The media sensationalized the story, referring to Henrietta as a black woman whose cells have made her immortal, and, crucially, revealing her full name. The Lacks family, seeing their private history splashed across national headlines, was devastated. They learned the truth about their mother's contribution not from the doctors who took her cells, but from reporters. They finally understood that a tangible, living piece of their mother was being bought and sold for profit. "We ain't nothing," Henrietta's son Sonny would say. "We're her children, and we can't even afford to go to the doctor." The Lacks family spent decades fighting a quiet battle, not for money, although a multi-billion-dollar industry was built on her mother's body, but for recognition and control. They wanted the world to know the name of the woman behind the code. They wanted a voice in how her and now their genetic information was used. The scientific community continued to treat Henrietta as a biological artifact, publishing her complete genome sequence in 2013 without the family's consent, once again triggering a massive ethical controversy. The publication revealed sensitive genetic information about the entire Lacks lineage. This overreach finally forced a reckoning within the scientific establishment. The NIH agreement. Following the 2013 controversy, the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, stepped in and brokered an unprecedented agreement with the Lacks family. The NIH promised to take down the public HeLa genome sequence. They established a 6-member committee, including 2 members of the Lacks family, to review and approve every application by scientists seeking to use the whole genome data of the HeLa cells. This gave the Lacks family unprecedented real-time control over a critical piece of scientific data. This agreement established a new principle: the need to consider the interests of research participants and their families, even posthumously. This agreement was a landmark moment, fundamentally changing how the scientific community relates to human tissues and genetic data, particularly concerning vulnerable populations. An ethical revolution. The story of Henrietta Lacks is more than a historical footnote. It is the genesis of modern bioethics. Her case directly informed the creation of the Belmont Report, 1979, and the establishment of institutional review boards, or IRBs, which are now mandatory for nearly all medical research. These boards are tasked with ensuring the ethical treatment of human subjects, particularly the principle of informed consent, a principle that was violently absent in Henrietta Lacks's treatment in 1951. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about race, poverty, and power in American medicine. It is a cautionary tale about how easily science can dehumanize an individual when the quest for knowledge is separated from basic human dignity and respect. The Monument. Today, the Lacks family maintains a powerful presence in the conversation. They partner with universities, speak at medical conferences, and tirelessly educate the public about the woman behind the cells. A headstone now marks Henrietta Lacks's grave, a stone that reads, Henrietta Lacks, August 1st, 1920, to October 4th, 1951. In loving memory of a phenomenal woman, wife and mother, who touched the lives of many. Here lies Henrietta Lacks, HeLa. Her immortal cells will continue to help mankind forever. Eternal love and admiration from her family. Her son Lawrence, daughter Deborah, who sadly passed before the publication of the definitive biography, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and her grandchildren and great-grandchildren have ensured that her legacy is a story of a woman, not just a biological product. They have transformed a hidden injustice into a public lesson on ethics, race, and medical history. The name HeLa may be the most recognized human cell line in the world, the biological powerhouse behind every modern breakthrough, from cancer treatments to gene editing. But now, thanks to her family's dedication, her full name, Henrietta Lacks, is finally properly recognized as the true astonishing source of medical immortality. Her cells live forever, and in doing so, her story is finally beginning to live too. This story is not over. Henrietta Lacks's cells are the foundation of modern medicine, and her life story is the foundation of modern bioethics. If you were astonished by this history, please do 3 things. Like this video to help share Henrietta's story. Subscribe for more untold history like this every week. Click here to watch our next video detailing the Tuskegee syphilis study, another shocking event that forever changed medicine. Thank you for watching.